Before the name became legend, there was just a boy. Quiet, unnoticed, already slipping through the cracks. What if the real horror isn't what he did later, but how no one stopped him from becoming it? Richard Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Julian Tapia Ramirez and Mercedes Munoz, a Mexican-American couple who tried to anchor their family in faith, tradition, and hard work. On North First Street, in a modest, single-story home, just blocks from Concordia Cemetery, the Ramirez household carried the hum of working-class routine, marked by early mornings, rotating shifts, and Sunday services. His father labored for the Santa Fe Railroad. His mother worked in a boot factory, often standing for hours at a time to help support the family. The children, Robert, Joseph, Reuben, Ruth, and Richard, shared bedrooms, passed down clothes, and followed rules that rarely bent. The home itself was small, but neatly kept. The kitchen smelled of coffee and beans in the morning. The radio played softly, while the mother prepared breakfast before sunrise. A crucifix hung above the hallway doorframe. In the evenings, the children might sit quietly in the living room while Mercedes ironed clothes or listened to her stories. On certain nights, the father would walk in quietly after work, his boots caked with dust, and collapse into his chair without a word. Other nights felt colder, even before he stepped through the door. Ruth, the only daughter, once said that you could feel it in the walls, like the house itself was holding its breath. What outsiders saw was a devout, church-going Mexican-American family trying to raise children right. But behind closed doors, the siblings described something different. They whispered about walking on eggshells, about the way the air changed depending on their father's mood. The youngest, Richard, grew up in a home where unpredictability was normal, and silence often meant danger. Julian Ramirez had once served as a police officer in Juarez, Mexico, a detail that later colored how he viewed discipline and control. After immigrating with his family, he took a job with the Santa Fe Railway. Honest, backbreaking work. He considered himself a provider, a man who demanded obedience and respect. But beneath that self-image was a man whose temper ruled the household. Richard's older brothers remembered seeing the transformation, a quiet sigh becoming a storm, a casual complaint turning into threats, calm dinners shattered by sudden shouts. The siblings later recounted how, when Julian drank, which became more frequent in the late 60s, his temper turned volatile. Shoes became projectiles. Doors shook under his fists. Conversations ended abruptly in slammed fists or broken objects. Ruth described hiding behind the kitchen counter during one of his outbursts, too afraid to breathe. One of the brothers once watched as their father threw a chair across the room when Richard knocked over a glass. They all learned to disappear into corners of the house when the mood turned. Richard was only 4 years old when he suffered one of several traumatic head injuries. In one instance, he was struck so hard he lost consciousness. The incident was not documented by doctors. Few were in families like theirs, but his siblings remembered the panic. His sister said he lay on the floor for minutes, eyes fluttering, while the family hovered, unsure whether to call for help. Later studies by psychologists would suggest that such head trauma, especially in early childhood, may contribute to neurological issues tied to impulse control and emotional regulation. But at the time, it was just another moment in a house where suffering wasn't spoken about, only endured. Despite the fear he instilled, Julian likely did not see himself as cruel. Neighbors described him as proud, even disciplined. At church he stood tall, never missed a mass, and bowed his head during prayers. He didn't socialize much, but he was respected. That duality, what the world saw versus what the family lived, defined the Ramirez home. The father saw punishment as correction. He thought fear would produce strength. What it produced instead was detachment. Richard's relationship with his father was shaped less by words and more by looks, by gestures, by silence that carried threat. He learned early not to ask questions, He stopped crying when punished. He stopped reacting altogether. Mercedes, his mother, remained quiet during most confrontations. She was devout and dutiful, but she, too, was worn down. She had suffered several complications during pregnancy and was exposed to chemical fumes in the boot factory where she worked. Some speculate this affected Richard in utero, though that's never been medically confirmed. What is known is that she endured and prayed, even as her youngest son began slipping away emotionally, right in front of her. Ruth later said that sometimes, late at night, she would check on Richard and find his bed empty. More than once he had climbed out the window and walked to Concordia Cemetery to sleep among the tombstones. He said the dead didn't yell, she once recalled. To a child of 10, that was comfort. Think about what it means when a graveyard becomes safer than your own room. School offered no real refuge. Richard attended Jefferson High but was frequently absent or disengaged. Teachers described him as quiet, sometimes distracted, but not a discipline problem. He didn't lash out, didn't fight, didn't curse, but he didn't smile either. He drew images that disturbed classmates. He once told another student that he liked being alone because people don't make sense. None of the adults in his orbit, teachers, neighbors, or even clergy, recognized the depth of emotional damage behind his blank stare. Within the family, the children began growing up and out. His older brothers left home, got married, found work. Ruth moved out when she could. Richard, still in elementary school, was left behind. The air in the house only grew heavier. By the time he was 10, he had already been introduced to marijuana. His cousin Miguel had returned from Vietnam and began influencing him heavily. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, Richard was a child shaped by a father who mistook fear for order, and a household that taught silence was safer than truth. It's important to understand that the Ramirez household was not uniquely evil. It was, in many ways, a reflection of thousands of homes across America during that time, where emotional restraint was mistaken for strength, where corporal punishment went unchecked, and where pride often prevented men from recognizing their own unraveling. But this home, this father, and these early years created a foundation upon which far darker things would later be built. Richard learned how to survive without being seen. He learned how to hide thoughts, suppress reactions, and observe danger from the shadows. In that house on North First Street, he learned how to disappear, until the day he decided to reappear on the front pages of every newspaper in America. He was still just a boy, but something had already taken root, and someone was about to water it. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with, "I am still here. Let's see who is still watching." He was 8 years old when Ruth first noticed his bed was empty. She thought he had snuck off to the kitchen for snacks or maybe fallen asleep on the couch again. But the couch was empty. The door was still locked. And Richard, her youngest brother, was nowhere inside the house. By morning he was back. No explanation. Just dirt on his shoes, dried grass on his jeans, and eyes that didn't blink much anymore. What she discovered, days later, was that Richard had found a place to sleep where the silence didn't come with strings. Concordia Cemetery sat a few blocks from their home on North First Street. The iron gates creaked open just enough for a child to squeeze through. Inside, the gravestones leaned like crooked teeth in the sand. Some bore names worn down by the sun. Others had flowers, faded and dry. There were no sirens, no shouting, just the wind pushing dust through stone paths, and a stillness that made sense to him. Richard would return to that place often. He didn't bring toys. He didn't explore like a curious boy might. He'd lie flat between rows of graves, arms folded, eyes scanning the stars above. Ruth once followed him, afraid he'd wandered too far. He wasn't scared, she later said. He looked peaceful, like this was where he belonged. To most children, a cemetery would spark fear or fascination. To Richard, it offered something simpler: relief. The house was where chaos lived. His father's anger could arrive without warning. The kitchen could turn cold in seconds. A wrong word, a dropped glass, Anything could shift the night. At Concordia, nothing shifted. The dead did not move. They did not raise voices or slam doors. They had already endured everything they ever would. That certainty became comfort. Modern psychologists describe this as a coping mechanism rooted in early trauma. Children who live in unpredictable or threatening environments often gravitate toward isolation as a way to self-soothe. These aren't games. They're rituals, designed by the child's mind to manage overwhelming stress. For Richard, Concordia wasn't a dark place. It was the only place where he didn't have to flinch. He never told teachers where he went. He didn't have the words to explain, and no one asked. The quiet boy with sunken eyes and scuffed shoes simply drifted further into his own world, one where calm only existed among gravestones. By the time Richard turned 6, the events shaping his emotional world had already done more damage than anyone realized. His siblings later confirmed that he suffered multiple head injuries in early childhood. One incident involved a metal swing that struck him in the head at a local park. Another came from a dresser he tried to climb, which tipped and landed squarely on him. There were also unexplained bruises, things that happened at home but weren't talked about. What they all had in common was silence. No hospital visits, no scans, no reports. At the time, no one imagined how permanent the effects might be. But decades later, forensic psychologists studying his case concluded that these injuries likely affected his temporal lobe, a part of the brain responsible for regulating emotion, impulse control, and memory. The damage, though invisible, was real. And it didn't happen in isolation. It happened in a household where fear was already a daily meal. Inside the home, his father remained a towering presence. Julian Ramirez, once a Juarez police officer, now a laborer for the Santa Fe Railroad, believed in rules, discipline, and consequences. When his temper ignited, the entire house braced. Ruth remembered counting her breaths whenever her father returned home late. The slamming of the screen door was the cue. Everyone froze. On one occasion, Richard had done something small, a spilled drink, maybe a forgotten chore. The details were lost. What stayed with the family was the moment Julian reached for the hallway closet. His voice dropped to a whisper, his hands clenched. One of Richard's older brothers stood between them, unwilling to let the night escalate further. That moment passed, but the memory stayed. The specifics of what was said were never repeated. The father's rage wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, focused, the kind of threat you don't need to repeat for a child to carry it for life. Richard changed after that. Not all at once, but enough for his siblings to notice. He flinched more. He rarely laughed, and when confronted, he no longer argued. He simply stopped responding. This emotional shutdown is a common feature in children exposed to what experts now call toxic stress, prolonged exposure to fear or danger without consistent adult support. The result isn't always obvious. It can look like obedience, like silence. But underneath, the child is learning to survive by becoming invisible. In school, Richard was marked present. Sometimes. He sat in the back of class, rarely speaking. Teachers described him as quiet, respectful, a little spacey. He never got into fights, never disrupted. But he didn't engage either. His mind had begun drifting inward. He was developing what clinicians call dissociative patterns, mental habits that allow a person to disconnect from their surroundings in times of stress. These habits, while useful in the moment, can later disconnect actions from consequences. He began drawing odd things in his notebooks: skulls, knives, shadows. Classmates noticed but said nothing. It was the 60s, and boys being boys was the phrase of the time. Teachers didn't see red flags. They saw a troubled kid who kept to himself. That's how so many things got missed. It's important to understand that this wasn't just a case of physical punishment or bad parenting. It was a complete environment, emotional, neurological, cultural, that failed to protect a child who needed more than discipline. He needed safety. He needed guidance. But in his world, survival was measured by how well you stayed unnoticed, and Richard had mastered that skill. Ruth, who remained emotionally closest to him during those years, later said, "He stopped looking at people. He just watched them, like he was taking notes." Her words mattered, because even as a child, Richard was already turning inward, not to escape pain, but to organize it, to make sense of the fear, the rituals of sleeping at the cemetery, the silence during punishment, the hours spent staring through classroom windows. They weren't meaningless. They were training. The boy wasn't just being shaped by trauma. He was adapting to it. In the Ramirez home, the cross didn't only hang on the wall. It watched. It loomed over the living room doorway, its quiet presence as much a warning as a blessing. Richard Ramirez, the youngest of 5, learned to fear that symbol long before he understood what it truly meant. The Ramirez family's Catholicism was not casual. It was committed. Church was mandatory. Rosaries were said aloud, and the Virgin Mary was spoken of with reverence that bordered on sacred fear. The house was filled with spiritual reminders, crucifixes on bedroom walls, prayer candles glowing in the kitchen window, framed saints watching silently from corners. These images, meant to offer comfort, came to represent something else in Richard's earliest memories. Julian Ramirez, Richard's father, saw faith and control as one and the same. He believed structure came from God, and structure demanded obedience. His interpretation of discipline, shaped by his own upbringing in rural Mexico and years as a police officer in Juarez, was both physical and symbolic. When his sons misbehaved, consequences followed, and those consequences were sometimes accompanied by scripture. Richard's siblings later recalled being forced to kneel on uncushioned floors for long periods, palms pressed together, whispering prayers under the glare of a parent watching for any sign of fatigue. "Say it again," Julian would instruct, not as a priest, but as an enforcer. If a voice faltered, the punishment extended. At times, he would recite verses from memory while the children remained on their knees, turning moments of correction into theological performances. This is what trauma psychologists now recognize as spiritualized discipline, the use of religious practices not for enlightenment, but for submission. When rituals meant to uplift are reshaped into tools for correction, the emotional fallout can be profound. It rewires how a child interprets right and wrong, not as moral choices, but as threats tied to ritual. For Richard, this was not simply about kneeling or memorizing words. It was about control disguised as sanctity. The very language of religion, grace, mercy, redemption, became secondary to the fear of misstepping in front of someone who claimed to speak with spiritual authority. He began to associate holiness not with peace, but with power. He didn't run from religion. He absorbed it, misunderstood, weaponized, and slowly disfigured. His mother, Mercedes, carried her faith differently. Quiet, steadfast, and exhausted from long hours at the boot factory, she often lit candles for her children when the house was finally still. She prayed in whispers, her rosary beads worn smooth from use. Richard sometimes watched her from the hallway, standing in the flickering light, whispering the same words every night. He never saw her use religion to threaten, only to ask for protection. But protection, in that house, often arrived too late, or not at all. The story first surfaced years later, whispered among neighbors and relatives. It wasn't documented in official reports, and it was never confirmed by the Ramirez family. But like all legends born from truth and trauma, it stuck. The tale described a punishment so unusual that it blurred the line between discipline and something closer to ritual. According to the account, Richard, still a child, was tied to a wooden cross in Concordia Cemetery overnight as punishment for misbehavior. No one could say what he had done. The details changed in each retelling. Some said his arms were spread wide, mimicking the crucifixion. Others said he was simply lashed to a wooden frame. What remained consistent was the setting, the same cemetery where Richard had once found peace. If true, the punishment was more than physical. It was symbolic inversion, turning the one place Richard had once fled to for safety into a tool for humiliation and fear. It's the psychological equivalent of collapsing sanctuary into a sentence. Even if the act wasn't intended to echo the crucifixion, the implication was unavoidable. punishment framed in the image of suffering as salvation. To this day, Richard's family denies the event ever occurred. When asked in interviews, surviving members dismissed it as exaggerated rumor or outright fiction. But others, distant relatives, old classmates, community members, remember the whispers. One said he saw Richard the next morning walking home alone from the cemetery, his head down, his clothes dusty and torn. Whether that was the aftermath of a real event or an echo of something else, no one knows for sure. But as one local put it plainly, even if that night didn't happen, something like it did. And perhaps that's what matters most. The cemetery, once Richard's refuge from chaos, had now become part of the cycle. Here it returned as a setting for control. This shift speaks volumes, not just about what may have been done, but about how deeply Richard's sense of safety had been dismantled. Punishment is meant to correct behavior. Ritual is meant to transform. But when the two are confused, the result is often psychological distortion. The child doesn't learn empathy or consequence. They learn fear disguised as meaning. And that's what Richard carried forward. By adolescence, he wasn't just afraid of doing wrong. He was fascinated by what wrong even meant. What if pain was sacred? What if control was divine? What if suffering wasn't something to avoid, but something to command? Trauma experts often describe this evolution as religious reversal. Instead of abandoning faith, individuals reinterpret it through the lens of their trauma. They keep the symbols, the language, the rituals, but invert their meaning. Richard wouldn't go on to reject spiritual belief. He would repurpose it, molding it into something darker, more personal, more transactional. Not a relationship with God, but a negotiation with power. Later in life, during trial and incarceration, he would use religious terms casually and carelessly, speaking about higher powers, fate, and energy. He would draw symbols associated with death and punishment, some from religious tradition, others from darker interpretations. Courtroom observers noted that he sometimes quoted scripture and twisted it into declarations of defiance. His understanding of the sacred had been fractured early and never repaired. Ruth, his sister, once said that Richard stopped looking at crosses the way he used to. They didn't seem to calm him anymore, she said. They made him angry. Or amused. I couldn't tell. This shift, from reverence to reinterpretation, is key. For Richard, the cross had become personal. Not a symbol of hope, but a reminder that suffering could be shaped and directed, first against himself and later against others. In 1972, a man stepped off a faded Greyhound bus in El Paso. He wore army fatigues, combat boots worn from use, and a stare that didn't flinch. His name was Miguel Ramirez, known to family as Mike. He had served in the Vietnam War, reportedly as part of a special operations unit. Whatever he saw, whatever he didn't bring medals or stories of heroism. He brought silence, and a kind of presence that made even the adults pause when he entered a room. To 12-year-old Richard Ramirez, Miguel wasn't just a returning soldier. He was everything Richard wasn't allowed to be: free, feared, respected. While Richard's father ruled with volume and strict order, Miguel's power came quietly. He didn't demand obedience. He didn't explain himself. He just existed. And people moved around him. That difference fascinated Richard. He followed Miguel the way a shadow follows a figure, silent, observant, waiting. At first, it was about proximity. Lighting his cigarettes, fetching his beer, listening from the edge of the room as Miguel spoke in clipped sentences about the jungle, the villagers, the things nobody else would understand. Miguel never bragged, but what he didn't say was as loud as what he did. Soon, the bond deepened. Richard began skipping chores to spend time with his cousin in the garage. Miguel taught him how to oil a rifle, how to fold a knife so the blade didn't nick the hand. He let Richard hold weapons like they were instruments, tools with weight, precision, and purpose. Richard had never been trusted with anything sharp or dangerous in his own home, but Miguel placed them in his hands like secrets. More than anything, Richard craved that trust. It wasn't just admiration. It was a quiet appointment, an unspoken declaration that he had been chosen to receive knowledge no one else in the family was allowed to hear. He never said Richard was special, Ruth later recalled, but he didn't say that to anyone else either. Miguel's version of the war wasn't shaped by strategy or honor. He spoke about it the way a man might recount a series of storms, brutal, fast, and soaked in aftermath. He didn't glorify it, but he didn't regret it either. His stories were filtered through half-smoked cigarettes and dim garage lighting. He talked about what it felt like to watch people scatter at the sound of a helicopter, what it meant to walk into a village and not know who was dangerous until it was too late. He talked about fear like it was a currency. Richard absorbed every word. To most children, these would have been nightmares. But to Richard, they sounded like power. It wasn't that he didn't understand what Miguel was saying. It's that he was learning to understand it differently. Psychologists would later describe this period as Richard's point of psychological modeling, when an older, admired male figure introduced a belief system where fear was not something to survive, but something to own. Miguel became more than a cousin. He became a quiet mentor in the economy of control. One afternoon in the garage, Miguel reached into an old duffel bag and pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside was a stack of images, small, square snapshots worn at the edges, smudged with use. They weren't labeled. They didn't need to be. These were not tourist photos or family portraits. They were fragments of war, frozen moments captured by a man who wanted someone else to see what he had seen. Miguel laid them out slowly. He didn't describe them with shame or pride, just with the tone of someone explaining a past others couldn't grasp. He pointed out the setting, the expressions, the aftermath. To him, these were proof of experience, visual evidence of a world few returned from unchanged. To Richard, they were something else entirely. He didn't look away. He leaned closer. From a developmental standpoint, Richard was still at an age where his brain was learning to distinguish emotional nuance. Experts say that exposing a child to real-life images of suffering, especially when framed by someone they idolize, can permanently alter how they understand harm, mortality, and empathy. It isn't just desensitization, it's reconstruction. One psychologist reviewing his case would later write, "These weren't stories designed to frighten. They were teachings designed to normalize the control of life and death." And that's exactly what Richard began to internalize. He started asking questions, not about the people in the photos, but about the weapons, the tactics, the reactions. He wanted to know how Miguel moved, how he planned, how he made decisions. These were not the questions of a boy disturbed. They were the questions of a boy being reshaped. One image, according to later court discussions, seemed to linger in Richard's mind. The details were never disclosed publicly, but Miguel reportedly noticed the fixation and laughed. "You like that one, huh?" he said. Richard said nothing, but he stared long enough for the moment to be remembered years later. In a clinical sense, Richard was now associating power with proximity to violence, not just its execution, but its framing. Because Miguel never presented what he showed as wrong. He didn't call it evil, he called it necessary, and Richard began to believe him. Outside the garage, life went on. School notes were ignored. Teachers noted his growing detachment, but no interventions followed. At home, his father remained strict. His mother prayed. His siblings drifted into their own lives. But Miguel's influence remained constant. Ruth noticed the change first. "His whole face changed," she said. "He used to flinch when Dad yelled. Now he just stared. He started standing like Miguel, shoulders set, arms crossed. He even paused before he answered questions, like he was calculating." She said it felt like Richard had stopped being part of the house, even when he was in it. He began drawing things, weapons, shadows, silhouettes, the kind of sketches that didn't raise alarms at the time but would later make perfect sense. They weren't artistic, they were instructional, like blueprints for a mind that had decided it preferred distance over connection. Richard wasn't just watching Miguel, he was rehearsing him. And Miguel noticed. He didn't stop the stories. He told more. He didn't hide the images. He shared new ones. Whether he meant to mold Richard or not, the effect was irreversible. This wasn't a case of a teenager stumbling across violence. It was the slow, deliberate transmission of a worldview, one where control, not conscience, dictated behavior. Psychological studies into similar criminal development patterns often cite intergenerational modeling of harm as a central cause. In these cases, a young mind isn't simply exposed to trauma. It's handed a moral framework where harm equals power and emotional response equals weakness. That is what Richard received from Miguel. A framework, a vocabulary, a belief system with no exit. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. On May 4, 1973, the quiet in El Paso, Texas was shattered. Inside a modest home, 13-year-old Richard Ramirez sat on a worn-out couch, his eyes fixed ahead, but unfocused. The air was still, unnaturally so, until the sound of a single gunshot sliced through the silence. In that moment, everything changed. Miguel Mike Ramirez, Richard's older cousin and former Green Beret, stood a few feet away with a weapon in his hand. His wife, Jessie, had just been shot during a heated argument. It wasn't an accident. Authorities later said Miguel acted with full intent, and the weapon was discharged at close range. Yet the most haunting detail wasn't just what happened. It was how young Richard reacted. He didn't cry. He didn't run. According to a neighbor who rushed over after hearing the shot, he just sat there, calm, blank, like nothing happened. While Miguel stood over his wife, Richard remained motionless, as if suspended between the real and unreal. For a child already grappling with disturbing influences, this moment cemented something irreversible. When the police arrived, Miguel surrendered without resistance. Officers described the scene as emotionally barren. Miguel was arrested and charged, but a legal process would soon unfold that sidestepped a traditional prison sentence. Instead of incarceration, he was sent to a mental health institution after being declared unfit for trial due to psychological instability, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. In the days that followed, little attention was paid to the boy who had witnessed it all. Richard wasn't provided trauma, counseling. There was no psychological support. He was simply placed in the care of another family member, as if relocation could erase the memory. But the stain had already settled. After the shooting, Richard was moved into the home of his older sister Ruth. On the surface, it seemed like a safe decision. She was older, married, and had a stable household, or so it appeared. But the man she lived with had a reputation in the neighborhood, though few spoke openly about it. Ruth's husband, Roberto, was known to have a troubling interest in spying on women. According to local reports and later interviews, he was frequently caught peering through windows after dark, though no formal charges had ever stuck. For Richard, this environment became a different kind of battlefield. In Miguel's house, he had been exposed to physical violence and war stories. Now, he was introduced to something more covert, deviant curiosity and secrecy. Roberto didn't hide his behavior from Richard. In fact, he encouraged it. Late at night, he would take Richard along to observe women through bedroom windows, whispering about control and dominance in ways that made these acts seem acceptable. Normal, even. But it didn't end there. Inside Ruth's home were books that explored spiritual darkness. These weren't just horror novels. They were texts that flirted with occult ideas, mixing pseudo-religious imagery with violent fantasies. Roberto encouraged Richard to read them, treating them as sacred knowledge rather than fiction. Over time, Richard's curiosity evolved into fixation. Around this time, Richard also began experimenting with drugs. Marijuana was the first, often shared with Roberto or peers from the neighborhood. Later came substances that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. These altered states only amplified the imagery and ideas swirling inside his mind. The books, the voyeuristic outings, and the violence he had witnessed, all of it began to merge in a landscape where morality no longer had clear borders. By the time he entered high school, Richard had already become isolated. Teachers described him as quiet but unnerving. He often stared into space during class, and his drawings, when he bothered to turn any in, were filled with images that hinted at a deep disturbance. His grades slipped, his hygiene declined, and he began skipping school for days at a time. No one connected the dots. Few even tried. What was happening to Richard wasn't just the product of a single violent event. It was the result of compounded exposure to violence, to secrecy, to distorted ideas of masculinity and power. Each environment he passed through reinforced the belief that empathy was weakness and control was everything. It's not that Richard was born without feeling. It's that little by little feeling became dangerous for him. The world had taught him that pain was power, and vulnerability was prey. As the months passed, the shooting of Jesse Ramirez faded from public memory. Miguel, after serving time in a psychiatric facility, returned to the fringes of the family. But for Richard, the memory was etched deeper than any scar. He had seen what a weapon could do. He had seen what silence could protect. And most dangerously, he had learned that in the absence of fear, violence could become ordinary. The shooting was not just a traumatic moment. It was a turning point. Before it, Richard was a troubled boy already steeped in disturbing influences. After that, he was changed, detached, hardened. Whatever boundaries remained inside him, between what was acceptable and what wasn't, began to erode, and nobody was watching closely enough to notice. At Jefferson High School in El Paso, few students ever looked twice at Richard Ramirez. On paper, he was just another quiet kid lost in the shuffle, frequently absent, academically slipping, and nearly invisible to faculty. His teachers described him as sleepy, polite, disengaged. To them, he was the kind of student you didn't worry about because he never made noise. He turned in half-finished work, sometimes not at all. His eyes often looked glazed over. If he smiled, no one remembered it. But his classmates told a different story. In the back of classrooms and behind gym lockers, Richard had a presence that felt unsettling. He kept to himself, but carried around a tattered notebook, one filled with sketches that made other students whisper. The images inside weren't just abstract doodles or cartoon figures. Instead, they showed motionless bodies, faces without eyes, and jagged instruments drawn over and over with obsessive precision. Some classmates swore they saw words written beside the drawings, phrases about death, silence, and watching. Others remembered him staring for too long at things no one else noticed. One girl recalled, "He wasn't aggressive, but you felt like he could see through you. He rarely spoke in class. When he did, his voice was low and slow, like he was measuring each syllable." A math teacher once told the counselor's office that Richard seemed exhausted all the time, but nothing came of it. Another instructor wrote on a progress report that he was non-threatening, simply withdrawn. But withdrawal was only one side of him. To the handful of students who got close enough to see beyond the surface, there was something colder underneath. He talked about the night. He asked strange questions about what it would feel like to vanish. But the adults never saw any of that. No intervention was made. No parent-teacher conference held. His absences piled up. His grades collapsed. Still, no one reached out. No one asked why a once playful child now looked like a shell of himself. Richard slipped through the cracks of the very system that was supposed to catch him. Years later, when headlines would name him for things no one could ignore, the school would issue a single statement. "We are deeply saddened by the events that have come to light. Our thoughts are with the families affected." But for Richard, back in 1975, there was no concern, no thought, just silence. And silence was something he was already used to. At home, Richard's descent moved faster. After being placed in the care of his older sister Ruth and her husband, his daily life changed in ways that left permanent damage. The home lacked stability, structure, or compassion. Richard had once known discipline under his parents. Strict, sometimes too strict, but now there were no rules. Ruth's husband introduced him to more than bad habits. He normalized things no teenager should see, let alone be drawn into. Richard was exposed to voyeurism, substances, and distorted ideas about power and control. By age 15, Richard was regularly using marijuana and experimenting with stronger substances, including LSD. The drugs dulled him. Friends later described how he would stare for hours, unmoving, his thoughts caught in loops no one could enter. His speech became disconnected. He began mumbling about visions. He said he could see patterns in the sky, messages in static. Some days, he spoke of light and shadow like they were people. Whether the drugs had fully reshaped his mind, or whether they just cracked open something that was already unraveling, no one could say for sure. At school, his presence diminished further. He would sometimes show up wearing the same clothes for days. His hygiene declined. He stopped bringing notebooks, and instead carried a small pouch filled with trinkets, bits of string, burnt matchsticks, and objects no one could explain. When he was caught stealing from a local store, a handful of candy bars and a knife, no charges were filed. The owner knew his family and let it slide. Richard never thanked him. He just walked away, eyes low, expression blank. Those who interacted with him described a boy in slow-motion collapse. His laughter, once a rare but human sound, disappeared altogether. His eyes, once curious, now seemed distant, as though he was looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. But he was still just a teenager, just a kid in a broken household, wandering through a school system that saw him as a statistic, not a person. And the worst part? No one even thought to ask if he was okay. Counselors at Jefferson High were overworked and under-resourced. Files piled up. Richard's name appeared in 1 or 2 attendance reports flagged for chronic absence. But he was never called in. There were no home visits, no mental health check-ins. He simply faded into the margins. And those margins turned dark. At some point, Richard stopped trying to hide his obsession with death. He stopped drawing in secret. His sketches became more disturbing, more precise. And still, no questions, no referrals, no calls to his guardians. It was as if he had already been written off as someone who wouldn't make it. A boy people, assumed would either drop out, disappear, or become someone else's problem. The truth was, he was already becoming someone else. Just not the kind of person society was prepared to handle. The camera told one story, but the shadows behind the lens told another. In 2021, Netflix dropped its high-profile docuseries on Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. Millions watched. The pacing was relentless, the visuals terrifying, the mood dark and stylish. But beneath the blood-splattered screen and chilling voiceovers, something essential was missing. The man behind the monster was barely visible, and the silence around his origins wasn't just an oversight, it was a missed opportunity. Because Ramirez didn't appear from nowhere. His descent began long before his crimes, long before his mugshot became a meme. What Netflix didn't show is how a child was broken before he ever broke the law. Ramirez was only 12 when he began sleeping in cemeteries. Not for fun, not for rebellion, for escape. At home, he watched his father beat his siblings until the walls shook. When he couldn't take the shouting anymore, he'd climb out his bedroom window and disappear into the graveyard down the road. He said it felt safer among the dead. This wasn't the seed of evil, it was the echo of pain. One unaddressed trauma at a time, Ramirez was learning to vanish emotionally. That story, that silent erosion, never made it into the episodes. The Netflix series hinted at a dark childhood, but moved quickly to the cat and mouse with detectives. The iconic chase, the face on wanted posters, the fear gripping Los Angeles. And yes, those were real. But so was the silence surrounding how childhood trauma mutated into pathology. The series became spectacle, prioritizing horror over history. It showed how Ramirez killed, but not how he was created. Not how neglect, abuse, and war crimes brought home by a deranged cousin rewired a young boy's brain before he ever held a weapon. Miguel Ramirez, Richard's older cousin, returned from Vietnam with a camera full of trophy photos and a mind wrecked by war. He didn't just tell stories, he showed Richard images of dismembered women and battlefield executions. Miguel described killing with pride, and Richard, barely a teenager, soaked it in. One day, Richard watched Miguel shoot his wife in the face, right in front of him. That was the moment the line between life and death, pain and power, snapped for Richard. But Netflix didn't put that scene in focus. No reenactment, no analysis, just a skipped beat in a montage. And yet, it was a defining fracture in the entire case. The truth is, no child becomes Richard Ramirez overnight. He wasn't born a serial killer. He was raised in an environment that punished sensitivity and rewarded silence. He suffered repeated head injuries as a child. By age 5, he was knocked unconscious by a dresser. At 6, he was hit with a swing, leaving him dazed for days. Studies now link such early head trauma to impulse control issues, violent tendencies, and warped emotional processing. Neurologists have long pointed out that serial killers often share similar brain damage in regions tied to empathy and regulation. The docuseries ignored all of this. It could have been a different kind of documentary. One that examined the ripple effects of untreated trauma, poverty, and unprocessed grief. One that dared to ask how many other monsters were simply children nobody caught in time. But instead, it leaned into stylized crime scenes and detective heroism. While the detectives certainly deserved credit, the audience was denied the full context. And in that denial, a more uncomfortable truth was lost, that the line between victim and villain can sometimes blur long before a crime is committed. This isn't to excuse Ramirez. What he did was horrifying. His victims deserve remembrance, not reduction. But humanizing the trajectory that led to those crimes isn't sympathy. It's understanding. It's how we prevent the next Ramirez. Not by obsessing over mugshots, but by studying the childhoods no one noticed. By asking the questions no episode dares to end on. Netflix gave us a story about a killer on the run. But they missed the one about a child abandoned by every adult who should have cared. And that's what they didn't show. By the time Richard Ramirez turned 18, the damage had already been done. Not from one single event, but from a lifetime of small explosions, each one shaping the blueprint of the man he would become. Experts would later call it a perfect storm of trauma. A psychiatrist once summarized it this way: "You don't excuse monsters, but you understand how they're made." Richard's story begins in El Paso, Texas, a border city of sunlight and silence, where working-class families tried to hold together under economic strain. His father, Julian Ramirez, had once served as a police officer in Juarez before becoming a railway laborer. He carried with him the pride and the temper of a man accustomed to command. At home, discipline was delivered with fear. Siblings would later recall nights when words turned to shouts, when doors slammed so hard that the walls seemed to breathe. From his earliest years, Richard lived inside this tension. He was a quiet child, obedient, watchful, often sitting near windows as if waiting for something outside to rescue him. But there were cracks forming even then. At 2 years old, he was knocked unconscious when a dresser toppled over him. At 5, a swing struck him across the head, leaving him dizzy and bleeding. Doctors treated the wounds, but not the consequences. Decades later, neurologists reviewing court files would point out irregular electrical patterns in his EEG results, evidence of possible temporal lobe damage. That region of the brain governs emotional regulation and impulse control. One medical expert noted that children with repeated head trauma often struggle to differentiate anger from danger. For Richard, both became the same feeling. The violence inside his home was mirrored by the strict religious devotion that framed it. The Ramirez household was deeply Catholic. Crosses hung in every room, candles flickered beside family portraits, and nightly prayers were recited with the weight of obligation, not comfort. To his father, sin required correction. To Richard, it created confusion. Salvation was preached through fear, and every mistake felt permanent. Later psychologists described this as religious trauma conditioning, where faith and punishment become indistinguishable. But the true pivot in his development arrived when his older cousin Mike Ramirez returned from Vietnam. Mike was a decorated veteran, but the war had shattered him. He came home with stories that no child should hear, and photographs that no one should ever see. He invited Richard, then 12, into a world where violence was currency. In the small, dimly lit living room of the Ramirez home, Mike bragged about combat kills, showing off his Polaroids of victims and calling them memories. It wasn't just what Richard saw, it was how his cousin told it. To Miguel, cruelty equaled power. To a boy searching for identity, that lesson took root. Over the months that followed, Richard began copying his cousin's habits. Smoking cigarettes, polishing weapons, listening to war stories as if they were instruction manuals. Then, in 1973, he witnessed something no child could process, an argument that ended with Miguel shooting his wife in front of him. The shock never left him. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He froze, paralyzed by something that psychologists later described as trauma stasis, where the mind detaches to survive what it cannot understand. Miguel was arrested and later institutionalized, but Richard received no therapy, no counseling, not even a school follow-up. The incident simply vanished from the records, like it hadn't happened. By 14, he was experimenting with marijuana and LSD. By 15, he had developed a fascination with occult imagery, a way, he claimed, to find power after years of fear. He began skipping classes, sleeping in cemeteries, and spending nights wandering the streets. Teachers described him as quiet, polite, but vacant. One recalled that he often drew disturbing images on his assignments, crosses twisted into knives, angels with their wings torn. No intervention came. Individually, these details might read as teenage rebellion, but together, they were something else entirely. Early brain trauma, domestic instability, religious confusion, graphic exposure to violence, neglect. Each factor alone could distort a personality. Together, they rewired it. Clinical profiles later concluded that Ramirez displayed traits consistent with post-traumatic stress compounded by frontal lobe impairment. He was not insane. He was shaped. And yet, shaping does not absolve. It only explains the trajectory, the long, invisible fall from victim to perpetrator. By 17, Richard had stopped pretending to belong. He drifted between part-time jobs, spending most evenings alone in his sister Ruth's home, where her husband introduced him to voyeurism and substance use. It was there, psychologists believe, that Richard's sense of moral detachment solidified. Boundaries blurred. Curiosity turned into compulsion. When asked years later about his adolescence, Richard offered only one sentence. It was different. He never elaborated. But behind those two words lies an encyclopedia of trauma. In the spring of 1978, Richard Ramirez boarded a bus headed west. He carried no luggage except a small duffel and a stack of cassette tapes. 18 years old, he was leaving El Paso for Los Angeles, a city that promised freedom but gave him anonymity. He wasn't running from the law. He was running from identity. In El Paso, he was the quiet boy from the troubled house. In California, he could be anyone. For a while, he drifted. He worked briefly at a hotel, cleaning rooms and delivering luggage. Within weeks, he was caught trying to enter a woman's room without permission. No charges were filed. The guest declined to pursue it. The job ended. The pattern began. He moved through downtown Los Angeles like a ghost, sleeping in motels, on park benches, and sometimes in abandoned buildings. The city in the late 70s was a patchwork of glamour and despair, neon signs against poverty's shadow. For someone already detached from empathy, it was a playground of opportunity. Psychologists studying his later behavior often point to these years as the activation period. The combination of substance use, neurological impairment, and chronic isolation can dissolve remaining moral boundaries. Ramirez was experimenting, with control, with thrill, with the illusion of invincibility. One friend from that period remembered him as two people in one body. Some days calm and polite, other days erratic and sleepless. He'd talk about religion, then about darkness, the friend said in a later interview, like he couldn't tell the difference anymore. In 1981, Ramirez's mental and emotional state deteriorated further. He started associating with small-time criminals, often joining petty thefts to survive. Each act pushed him further from the boy he once was. The detachment that had begun as self-protection evolved into moral absence. When he finally left Texas behind, he didn't just cross geography, he crossed a psychological border. He didn't just leave a city, one investigator later said. He left everything human behind. By the early 80s, Los Angeles was sprawling, restless, and unprepared for what was coming. Ramirez blended into the news, another face among thousands. But beneath that anonymity, the components of his pathology were aligning. Childhood head injuries that impaired inhibition, exposure to violence that normalized cruelty, a warped sense of faith that equated pain with power, and years of neglect that erased empathy. Forensic psychologists would later reconstruct this transformation in chilling detail. They noted that Ramirez's profile matched what criminologists call a compound personality fracture, the convergence of trauma, conditioning, and neurological dysfunction. He wasn't evil by nature, one expert remarked during a post-trial interview. He was what happens when every protective factor fails at once. And that is perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all, because if Richard Ramirez was made, not born, then his creation was collective. A household that punished more than it protected, a system that ignored repeated signs of distress, a society more fascinated by the outcome than the origin. When the Netflix series and other retellings later chronicled the crimes that earned him the name Night Stalker, they captured terror vividly, but they skipped the quiet years that made terror possible. The years when intervention could have changed everything. The journey from El Paso to Los Angeles was less about distance and more about disappearance. By the time Richard stepped off that bus, whatever remained of the frightened boy was gone. He was now a man untethered from conscience, a volatile product of brokenness disguised as destiny. He walked into California with nothing but time and the wrong kind of lessons. The rest would make history. Psychiatrists often warn that understanding the making of a monster is uncomfortable because it forces us to see the cracks in our own systems. Ramirez's descent was not inevitable, but it was predictable. Every missed warning sign, every untreated injury, every night he slept among the dead, all were markers on a road that society refused to light. His story doesn't erase accountability. It expands it. Evil isn't born in isolation. It's built quietly, in homes that hurt, in institutions that look away, in neighbors who mistake fear for discipline. And sometimes, by the time anyone notices, it's too late to ask when the child disappeared. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?